right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Yaron Brook Show. Oh, what happened there? All right, welcome to Yaron Brook Show. It's good to have you on this evening. We've got I think, a cool topic to talk about, a controversial topic to talk about, something that hopefully we can get everybody's engagement with. And I'm really curious to hear what what your views are, particularly if you work in Silicon Valley. We'll talk about it, as we'll talk about it in a minute. All right, what's the topic? This Google memo. I don't know if you've seen the news stories about the Google memo. I'm going to describe it, go into more details, tell you the story of what happened, and give you my estimation of the situation. Also, I'm curious to hear, as I said, what you think, particularly if you're female, particularly if you work in Silicon Valley. I'm interested in your perspective on what just happened in Google and what we can learn, if anything, from this. All right, so that's trying to make something work that's not working. All right. So about a week ago, or at least the end of last week, it was revealed that there was it was leaked out of Google, that there was a memo circulating within Google, published by an engineer, that articulated the case against the Google practice, and the practice now all over Silicon Valley, of hiring with the goal of gender diversity. In other words, hiring with the goal of increasing the number of women who work at these companies. So an explicit goal of increasing the number of women, particularly in engineering and in leadership positions. At Intel, for example, they are now have set the goal to hire 40% women every year in order to drive up the number of women in engineering fields within Intel, and they publish it every year, and they let you know how they're doing and so on. And this has, of course, been a huge point of discussion all over Silicon Valley for weeks, months, years, really years now. And women are underrepresented relative to the population. So let's just assume women are 50% of the population, and they are well below that in both executive positions and in tech positions, technology positions, and engineering positions in the high-tech world in Silicon Valley. So I think the numbers I saw, something, at Google, I think now women in tech positions are 13%. I think I saw a graph. I'll look it up in a minute, see if I can find that graph again. But the number's small relative to the perceived ideal, which is 50%. 50% seems fair. That's what they represented in the population. And the idea is they're underrepresented. And then the question is, of course, why are they underrepresented in tech? Why, if they're 50% women in the population, why are they're under 20% in some of these companies? Well, the standard answer is because of discrimination, because of biases, because people are discriminating against women in these companies. And so Silicon Valley companies, as companies, I think, in many industries, but in Silicon Valley, this is more prominent because Silicon Valley has made it a point, in a sense, of being at the forefront of progressive ideas. Silicon Valley has taken it upon himself, in particular, to go out and make a big deal out of trying to hire more women, and trying to hire them, again, specifically into, the measure really is engineering and executive positions, and a real push to try to hire into those in order to, and in a sense, to force it in order to overcome the discrimination. I mean, this is very much like what the affirmative action laws have tried to do with Black Americans. The idea is they're not hired in the appropriate numbers, or they're not admitted into universities in the appropriate numbers. Why? Because of bias, because of discrimination, because of racism. And therefore, we need to compensate for that discrimination and racism by forcing universities or employers to hire more minority students in order to reach an equilibrium. And of course, they tell us the story that one day when these biases disappear, the laws and the restrictions and everything will go away, right? Will go away, and we'll be able to hire people just on ability. So that's kind of the context. This memo was published, and I'm gonna read sections of the memo to you, and we'll get into kind of what the memo actually says. But the bottom line is the memo is very critical of this attitude, and the memo goes further than just being critical of the attitude. The memo basically, the memo also says, look, the primary reason that there's no parity between the number of women in the tech industry and the number of women in the population is that for evolutionary reasons, women are just have a different approach to solving problems. They have a different approach to dealing with some of these issues, and as a consequence of that, in a sense, they're less suited, or they're less suited for some of these programming jobs, some of these technical jobs, and even if they are, the way organizations are structured today is ill-suited for the way women do these jobs. And it goes into kind of evolutionary biological explanations for how women are different than men and why they would need a different work environment in order to thrive in a tech company than men do. Again, this is what the memo says. The memo is also an indictment, in a sense, of Google and I think many other companies for being super politically correct, for penalizing people and making people who hold conservative or libertarian or non-leftist ideas feel uncomfortable, even to the point of feeling psychologically unsafe. The memo suggests that people who hold these points of view are harassed at Google and other technology companies, and we'll get into that, and we'll get into what other technology companies are doing. I think that illustrates part of that point. So it's broader than just the issue of gender. It addresses the whole question of whether Google is open to ideas that are not shared, let's say, by upper management from a political perspective. It talks about the lack of political diversity at Google, or moral, even talks about moral diversity, the different moral opinions of diversity, and whether Google is open to this diversity, and he suggests it isn't, and it's very oppressive towards anybody who disagrees with the kind of leftist party line that many of the engineers, many of the leadership within Google are advocating for. Now, this memo was published in an internal kind of Google chat. Google has lots of forums where employees engage in all kinds of debates. Supposedly there are hundreds of these internal forums. Of course, if anybody out there is from Google and wants to comment or wants to share, you can do it anonymously if you're worried. That'd be great, and I'll be giving the phone number and encouraging you guys to call in with questions and stuff in a little bit. So this memo was put out in this forum, and a huge discussion erupted, of course, and some people supported it, and many people were opposed to it, and it created a lot of discussion. A lot of people were very upset by it. A lot of people claimed that they were going to leave Google if the memo was ignored by management. And then late last week, the memo was leaked, so it was published outside of Google, and as a consequence, the head of diversity, the VP of diversity at Google, who used to be the VP of diversity at Intel and now is hired at Google to do the same job, responded denouncing, in a sense, the memo and reaffirming Google's commitment to gender, I guess, their agenda of achieving gender equality in terms of numbers, in terms of hiring. And ultimately, this morning, the engineer who published this memo was fired. From Google. The CEO of Google came out and said that he had violated the code of ethics, the code of conduct, I think it was, at Google, and therefore he was fired. And part of what the writer had written was the idea that that all these companies are pushing for diversity of race, diversity of gender, diversity of all kinds of things, right? But the one thing that they object to, and the one thing they penalize, indeed, is diversity of opinion. And here he is. He was penalized for having a different opinion. Of course, his firing has caused a firestorm. You've got on the one hand, you've got many people applauding Google for, in a sense, by firing this guy, creating a safe environment for female employees, that what he advocated for was so horrific that people felt unsafe in the environment in Google, and it was good that he's gone. So there were a lot of op-eds, there's a lot of publications applauding Google for what they did. Of course, on the right, there are dozens, hundreds of op-eds and editorials condemning what Google has done and condemning Google and defending the memo and so on. And it's fascinating because what's happened in colleges and what we've seen in colleges is now hitting kind of the corporate space, and people are talking about, and I even saw the CEO, I think, of YouTube talking about microaggressions. So this language of colleges, this language of microaggressions is now entering kind of the workplace, and people are being fired for microaggressing, if you will, because what he did was supposed to be a microaggression. And it's speech that is interpreted as aggression, which is interpreted as force, is interpreted as therefore creating an unsafe workplace, and therefore a legitimate reason to fire somebody. And this engineer was fired. CNN, and this is great because some of the headlines are just so sweet, because a lot of the headlines show you the bias, the inherent bias in the news. And CNN, I mean, this is a perfect one. CNN title is, "The Google engineer who wrote a memo that argued women aren't biologically fit for tech jobs is out at the company." If you read the memo, and I encourage you to read the memo, it's not what he says. Now, I disagree with a lot of what he says in the memo, and we'll talk about that. I think he's wrong in a lot of what he says in the memo, and I put it this way: he presents this as sound and done science, and I question that quite substantially. And I think, I think this whole issue, is far more subtle and far more complex than what either side of this argument is actually suggesting. But the idea that he suggested that women aren't biologically fit for tech jobs is just not true. That's certainly not what he is saying. So that is exactly the kind of headline, which, how can you take CNN seriously when but of course, this is daily occurrences on all of the media. I mean, this is Fox and CNN and all of them, New York Times and Washington Post. They all have headlines like this. That's why you really, really, really have to be careful with anything you read in the media today, and research it and figure out whether what they're saying is even remotely true. And in this case, that is such a bogus headline. It's astounding. All right, so that's kind of the layout. I want to go over the memo and talk a little bit about the details of the memo and what he actually says. The good parts of the memo, and they are good parts of the memo. The bad parts of the memo, and they are really bad parts of the memo. Let's be clear. Google has every right to fire him. This is not an issue of free speech, because Google is not the government. Google can, in my view, should be able to hire and fire anybody it wants at its own discretion. The only people who should care about whether about this from a perspective of Google firing somebody are the shareholders of Google. Is this actually a good news for shareholders? The firing of this person, is it a step towards maximizing shareholder wealth? Is it good for Google in the long run to fire engineers who have these kind of opinions? Is it good to silence these people and create a certain culture? Is this consistent with the culture shareholders want for Google? And I doubt the share price is going to move that much, because I doubt shareholders are going to view this as particularly important. But Google has every right to decide what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, to discuss internally what creates a safe or unsafe workplace. I think we can criticize Google and say, you guys have got to be kidding, but legally, there's no question. So let's dismiss that. Now, it is curious, again, that Google is fine legally dismissing somebody who they disagree with from an ideas perspective. But if somebody advocated something wacky on the left, if somebody advocated for something completely wacky at Google on the left, or at any company on the left, and was dismissed for that, you would see civil rights advocates, you would see people in all kinds of organizations go apoplectic, and how can Google do this, and this is discrimination. I mean, imagine, well, we'll get to that, but imagine if Google dismissed somebody from circulating some thought pieces by Black Lives Matter, and dismissed it because they felt that it created an unsafe work environment. Or if they dismissed somebody for circulating feminist ideas internally at Google, I mean, people would go nuts. People would go crazy. The left would go apoplectic, just like the right is going apoplectic now. And of course, the right would flip. And this is why this is all the whole right, left, and the whole understanding of free speech, and the whole understanding of what diversity means, and the whole understanding of all this stuff is so corrupt and so geared towards your bias. Talk about bias. So the right jumps to defend somebody who's being fired because he has opinions they agree with. They would not pick up the case if it was somebody on the left who'd been dismissed because of ideas they held. And of course, the flip goes for the left and the right. So it's all flip, right? And CNN would not have written that headline if it was the other way around, but Fox's headlines would flip as well. So the amount of bias and non-objective thinking about all these issues, and about how to approach this whole issue, and how to approach the whole issue of gender and gender roles, and the whole idea of gender diversity and technology and gender and all these things. I mean, neither side has any clue how to approach it. And the problem is that once the left introduces collectivism into hiring, introduces this collectivistic group think into its hiring practices, then it isn't shocking that the right then is gonna introduce collectivistic ideas in trying to attack the collectivistic ideas of the left, that it all turns into one big collectivistic battle. Now, again, the author of this piece keeps hedging himself. I think there's certainly collectivistic premises there that have to do with his whole attitude towards evolutionary psychology, which we'll get to. But he tries to continuously say, no, I'm an individualist, and he does it in some ways in a convincing manner. So some of the portions of it are convincing. I have my doubts about the evolutionary psychology stuff that he brings up, but that's a good topic for us to discuss about this. But anyway, Twitter has gone nuts about this, left and right attacking each other and going at each other's throats. Obviously, this is huge in the high-tech community. People are commenting it, people are discussing it, and this all comes in the context of, let's bring in the broader context, and then I want to see if any of you want to discuss this on the phone, call in and discuss some of this. Actually, before I take it for the broader context, I'm going to take a really short break here, and then I want to talk about YouTube and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and some of the standards that they have and some of the things that have been going on where you could clearly see, in a sense, discrimination against people of certain views, where they don't discriminate against people of other views. It's pretty amazing. But, and this is getting a worse and worse trend, and this kind of fits into this whole Google discussion. All right, we'll be right back.
The mission of the Ayn Rand Institute is to promote Ayn Rand's philosophy of reason, rational self-interest, and laissez-faire capitalism. It's rare for employment to offer you the opportunity to impact the culture and make history. But that's exactly what we do at ARI, each and every day. We are currently looking for talented, passionate, and bright people who share our goal of raising awareness of Ayn Rand's ideas. Visit ari.aynrand.org to learn more about open positions and how to apply. That's ari.aynrand.org.
All right, so let's talk about what's going on in some of these other platforms, because there seems to be a kind of a general trend going on here. So let's take YouTube right now. YouTube, I think it was a week ago, shut down Jordan Peterson's account. And the assumption was, they never explained why they locked him out of the account. And I don't think it was a mistake. I think the reason they locked him out of the account was because they didn't like what he was saying. Now, he knew some people, and there was a big rally, and a lot of people complained, and Jordan Peterson was reinserted into YouTube, right? YouTube has also stopped monetizing some content that they find offensive. So Dave, a lot of these guys, Dave Rubin, others who make a living out of monetizing the content of a YouTube, have seen their revenues drop substantially because YouTube is not. Now, why are they not monetizing? Partially because advertisers don't want to be associated with certain content. But it's interesting, and I haven't looked at this, but my understanding is that this is not affecting, again, kind of leftist nutty content, Black Lives Matter and other really, nutty content that is going out there. There doesn't seem to be, advertisers and YouTube don't seem to be quite as sensitive to crazy stuff on the left, although they are trying to police or to shut down accounts of Islamists who are advocating for violence, clear violence. And they have shut down some leftist accounts. Patreon has shut down an account, and I just forgot his name again, just slipped from my mind. Somebody on one of the chats will give it to me. Kind of this conservative, mainly conservative blogger who is a big anti-immigration, and she's going to, I guess, she's in Europe, and she's trying to block the ships, Lawrence Southern, trying to block the ships from coming over from North Africa and bringing immigrants. And they blocked her account, claiming that she was advocating for violence. And, there's some question about what she actually claimed for. So there's some, minor credibility to it. But when you think about what some of these leftist groups are advocating for, it's not real. There's clearly a bias. Now, again, in all these cases, legally, they have every right to do it. Legally, that is it's their platforms. They can decide who can post there. They can decide who to feature, who not to feature, and so on. Somebody's saying Lawrence Southern is not anti-immigration. She's anti-Muslim immigration. I'm not going to argue that right now, although I find that almost everybody almost everybody lands up. It's like Trump wasn't anti-immigration. He was only anti-illegal immigration. But then when you actually get to his bill on immigration, it's anti-immigration. It's anti-illegal immigration. It's anti-all immigration. So I'm a little suspicious, but fine. She's anti-Muslim immigration into Europe. I'm not against being anti that in the context of the world we live in today. I've talked about that, but that's not my point. My point is that she was doing something the Patreon viewed as so-called as violent, and therefore they shut it down. They don't shut down others who are clearly advocating for violence, right? They have. So you're seeing a trend. Milo was banned from Twitter. Again, I'm not a fan of Milo's. You can see the podcast I did on Milo. You can find that about 6 months ago or so. I did a podcast on Milo. I'm not a fan, but there's far more offensive stuff going on Twitter than what Milo is doing, and those people are not banned, and because Twitter to some extent sympathizes with their philosophy. So there's no question in my mind that in Silicon Valley today there is a what they're calling deplatforming, taking away the platform from people that advocate for certain positions, or making it harder for them, or reducing their ability to monetize their content, or in some way penalizing people. And this is definitely a trend in Silicon Valley, and you're seeing it. Again, not a violation of free speech. They have every right, political right, to do it, but still something to worry about, something to, I think, speak up against, particularly when it is so flagrant that they're not treating kind of the people who are crazy ideas on the left, and that often the people on the right that they're going after are not people with crazy ideas. I mean, there are people with crazy ideas on the so-called right. They are racist. There is the alt-right. They are people who are, I don't want to be associated with, but that's not who they're going after. I mean, Jordan Peterson, I've done a show on Jordan Peterson. There's a bunch of things that I disagree with Jordan Peterson on, but he isn't a racist, hate mongerer, crazy nut, right? He's a thoughtful intellectual, speaking about interesting topics. And I disagree with a lot of what he has to say, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with what he says. But, to somehow ban him from these platforms is absurd. It's ridiculous, and it's sad. It's sad to see. Now there's some response in the marketplace. People are leaving Patreon in opposition, and showing their dissent, and there are new platforms being created to challenge this. And that's the way the market works, right? If you don't like the way a certain company functions, you create a different company. Oh, wait, you go and handle, you work with somebody else. Okay, so I want to go back to the Google issue. We're going to be talking about Google, and I want to talk about the memo. I've got the memo and some highlights of some of the stuff that he wrote in front of me. You can find the memo on Motherboard, which is, and on some of the other tech kind of publications. I'm really eager for you guys to call in. In particular, I'm eager for you to call in if you are if you work in Silicon Valley. In particular, if you're a female engineer in Silicon Valley. I'm curious, if some of this discrimination, if you've experienced it. And let me just say right off the bat, I certainly believe that there's discrimination, and I certainly believe that it's tough for women, and that women are often treated badly. Just like I do believe that there is racism out there, and I think that racism is quite prevalent in America. And I even agree that there is, and actually the writer of the memo even agrees that there's something called unconscious bias, that many people are biased even when they're not completely consciously aware of the biases. And I think all that actually exists out there. The question is, what do you do about it? Is a completely different question. But I think, and I see it all around me, that there are people who are biased against women in the tech industry. There's racism out there. All these things, a lot of the things, not all the things, a lot of things the left proclaims as problems are really there. To some extent, I think they exaggerate the extent. And of course, they misidentify the solutions to them. Okay, we've got already 2 callers, but the number to call is 347-324-3075, 347-324-3075. Call in if you have any thoughts. Oh, by the way, when you call, in order for me to know you want to ask a question, you have to press 1. 1 will indicate to me that you want to ask a question. So we're going to start right here. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hi, my name is Preeti. So my question is, Ayn Rand was against the idea of a woman president, and what do you have to say about that?
All right, you're going right to the essence. Okay, I'm going to take you offline to answer the question. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let me just say. So let's start by saying this. I think the whole question of gender and the whole question of the differences between men and women are primarily a psychological question and not a philosophical question. So these are primarily psychological observations and primarily something that psychology ultimately will have to answer. And I include that essay of Ayn Rand's where she says that she does not believe that a woman should be president, that a woman with self-esteem would want to be president, is not part of philosophy. That is psychological. And I'm going to say some things about that and about issues of gender. And I want to be clear, nothing I say, certainly nothing I say, is objectivism, right? I'm not Ayn Rand. Objectivism, what Ayn Rand said. It's also not, so objectivism doesn't really have anything to say, core philosophy, about whether a woman should be president, should want to be president. That, again, is a psychological point that Ayn Rand said. And I'll get into exactly what she said and why she said it. And I'll even say something about what I think about it and why she would never vote for a woman president. So those are psychological points. And anything I say about these issues is Yaron's limited understanding of the world, his observations of men and women, his limited understanding of psychology, some stuff I've read, but mainly just experience, and should not be taken as anything definitive in terms of objectivism, because this is not objectivism. All right. So what did Ayn Rand say? Ayn Rand said. So Ayn Rand's view was there is a difference between men and women, and there's a difference. There's a psychological difference between men and women, and femininity and masculinity were fundamentally different, and that they related to one another. That the essence of femininity, according to Rand, was hero worship. And that the hero was represented in the male. And that the essence of masculinity was the attainment of heroism, of heroic status. At some psychological level, she believed that the male is oriented, qua masculinity, is oriented towards reality and towards conquering reality, and the female is oriented towards the male, towards responding to the male, and that is the essence of what femininity and masculinity are. Now, that doesn't mean that women are not oriented towards reality. Think about Dagny. Think about running a railroad. Think about Dagny's attitude to sex. Think about Dagny's attitude to life. I mean, she is a first-hander. She is a businessman. She is a builder, a creator, a mover, a shaker, a shaper of reality. She is oriented, but in that part, which is sexual, which is her feminine side, she is oriented towards the worship of Reardon, Francisco, and ultimately John Galt. And that is what makes her feminine. That is what differentiates her, in a sense, from a man. A man and a woman can both do these jobs, can both run a railroad. There's nothing that limits a woman from running a railroad. There's nothing that limits a woman from doing a job in high tech, right? But when it comes to sex, when it comes to what it means to be a woman versus what it means to be a man, there is a difference. And it is about the woman responding to the man. It was about the woman worshiping the man. It is about the woman looking up, in a sense, to the man in her as a sexual being. And you can see how difficult it is for me to talk about this, because this is I'm a finance guy. What have you gotten me into? So that is Rand's view. Now, so she would say, for example, there's no problem a woman being CEO. There's no problem a woman being any position, certainly in technology. She wouldn't agree with this memo. She wouldn't agree with a lot of what's written in this memo at all, right? In terms of his position about women. But, so she wouldn't, she in every skill set, women have the ability to attain any achievement that a man attains. And again, Dagny Taggart is the awesome example of exactly that. Right? Now, what she argues in that essay that you refer to is that the president, and note her, the extent to which she admires the office of the president. The president is the ultimate position of, in a sense, authority, of achievement, of not achievement. Achievement's the wrong word. Of command. It's a commander-in-chief. It's the ultimate boss. And her view is that for a woman to be female, to be feminine, fully feminine, she has to be able to look up to a man. There has to be a man somewhere that she can look up to. Dagny still needs a John Galt, not as a boss, but as some kind of psychological model, some kind of model of heroism that she can look up to. And if you remember, when Dagny sees John Galt, it's love at first sight. I mean, this is the man, qua man. This is the essence of what masculinity, of what maleness is, and she's a worshiper from second one, right? Right from the beginning. And so for Rand, the president, if a woman is a president, who does she look up to? Who's a hero to her? And she can't see anybody who can be a hero to the president. And that's why she says a woman should never strive to be a president, because she doesn't want to be in a position where everybody around her is basically, in a sense, at her command. And that there's nobody in a position where she can hero worship, right? Now, note the amount of respect she gives the presidency, which is, given the last few presidents, I mean, oh my God. Right? These people don't deserve 1 ounce of hero worship or respect or anything. So, but that's a position, right? But this is not in any way to deny the ability of the woman to do the job. That is not the point. The point of Ayn Rand's is, to the psychology of the woman herself, this is unhealthy. And Ayn Rand would say, a woman who wants to be president is therefore, there's some problem in her psychology. She's not feminine in some important way, and therefore Rand, in a sense, wouldn't trust her to be president, and she wouldn't vote for her. All right, so do I agree with Ayn Rand? I mean, I think I agree, and with regard to the psychological nature of feminism and masculinity, and I know you guys are going to come after me on this, right? I think I agree with that, but I don't agree about the presidency. I don't agree because I guess I don't view the presidency as that elevated. I don't agree because I think that a woman could still have a partner and be president, have a partner that she can admire and she can worship, in a sense, as who's in business, who is in another field, who is still heroic. I don't think the president puts you in. I don't view the American presidency as having that kind of authority and that kind of stature and that kind of position that it would wipe out a woman's ability to worship. Now, I also think that in a world in which our presidential candidates are so pathetic, if there was a woman who was running that was any good, I would vote for her. So I would vote for her. So I thought Margaret Thatcher, for example, in Great Britain was an excellent leader. Again, Ayn Rand wouldn't say that the woman couldn't be an excellent leader, but I would have voted for Margaret Thatcher. I thought she did a fantastic job. She led well. And I don't know that being prime minister did psychological damage to her, other than all the nonsense you have to deal with as a prime minister, as a president. So I don't know that I would agree with Ayn Rand, but when it comes to Ayn Rand, I know some people in the chat here, disrespecting Ayn Rand's view, and I've seen this over and over again, and everywhere people disrespect. I don't disrespect any view that Ayn Rand held. Ayn Rand was a genius. She was, in my view, once in a millennium genius. Anything she said was incredibly thoughtful. She had incredible insight into things, even if I disagree with her. I don't consider anything she wrote gibberish. I don't consider anything she wrote stupid. I don't consider anything she wrote unfounded. I think she had reasons for everything she wrote, and anything Ayn Rand wrote should be taken seriously and thought about. And even if you read it and say, I don't agree with it, read it again, think about it, go deeper, and most of the time it'll turn out you were wrong and she was right. Again, she could be wrong, and in this case, maybe she was wrong, but I would never dismiss what she said. Never dismiss what she said about this. And again, this is not part of philosophy. This is part of psychology. But Ayn Rand was incredibly insightful when it comes to psychology. Incredibly insightful when it comes to psychology. And the fact is that as an author, as a novelist, I mean, if you want the character of a heroine, if you want the character of a strong woman, way ahead of her time, way before the feminist movement ever existed, way before anybody talked about women executives or glass ceiling or discrimination against women in the workplace, read Dagny Taggart. I mean, if you think Ayn Rand didn't understand psychology or didn't understand femininity or didn't understand women or didn't understand the place of women in a workplace or anything like that, read Dagny. I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant presentation. And again, the idea that you can just dismiss Ayn Rand as being wrong on something and just walk away without taking the full context of her achievement in terms of how she portrayed women is to me, you're being superficial and unthinking. So you can disagree at the end of the day, but don't dismiss anything she wrote, even when she's wrong, even when you think she's wrong. All right, I'm going to take another quick break, and then when we come back, I'm going to take another caller, and we'll keep this discussion going.
Looking for inspiration? Follow us on Instagram at Ayn Rand Org and get your daily dose of inspiring quotes, stories on how Ayn Rand fans connect in remote places, as well as updates on our popular student programs and upcoming events. You'll also see which celebrities are reading Rand and posting about it. Follow us today at Ayn Rand Org, AYNRAND.org, the official Instagram feed of the Ayn Rand Institute. See you there.
All right, we're back, and we're talking about this Google memo, and this brings up the whole issue of femininity, masculinity. It brings up the whole issue of discrimination and what discrimination means, and under what context discrimination is appropriate, and what context discrimination is inappropriate. And this is interesting topics, and yeah, these are not topics that are natural to me. You know, Jordan Peterson could just knock it off on these kind of topics. He might be wrong, but he can knock it out of the park and just talk about them because this is what he does for a living. I could talk about finance like that, but this is a challenge. But hey, you don't have to listen if you think this is too challenging. All right, you're listening to Yaron Brook Show, and we got a caller. Hi, you're on Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Oh, hi, Yaron. This is Dave from Portland. It's been a while.
Hey, Dave. It has been a while. How's it going?
Oh, great. Good. Yeah, just real quick, I just wanted to say, first of all, I thought your response was great. I think that was the most thoughtful response that I've heard around that issue, and I'm going to look forward to studying that later. I thought that was some great commentary you offered just now. Thanks.
Well, I'm curious to see what you think about this issue of Google.
Yes. So my question is actually in regard to the Google memo, and I totally agree that they have the political right to hire, fire, based on their own policies. But you started to touch on something. I wasn't sure if you're going to talk a little bit more I didn't quite make the connection that perhaps this attitude, this squelching of certain speech, even almost flavors of, triggers coming directly out of the universities, is this perhaps another example of something that starts in the universities and then filters out into the culture?
Yeah, there's no question, Dave. I mean, there's no question. This whole attitude towards speech, the whole attitude towards so-called microaggressions, the whole attitude towards, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, is coming straight out of the universities. It's coming straight out of these different courses. It's coming straight out of the political correctness movement and the new left that is dominating universities right now, and it's, I think it's going to create very hostile working environments if you are politically incorrect in any kind of aspect. So again, I'm curious to hear from people from Silicon Valley who can tell me how prevalent this is and whether this is really widespread, and whether they feel, as people who don't share kind of the popular point of view or the PC point of view, whether they feel discriminated against. I'm also curious to hear from women who work in Silicon Valley if they feel discriminated against because they're women by the engineering culture there. But yeah, this comes straight out of the universities. This comes straight out of the postmodern attack on collectivist attack on any kind of thinking that doesn't fit into this world of intersectionality, this idea of we're all members of groups and there's a hierarchy of oppression, and the least oppressed groups should be silenced because anything they say is going to be biased, and anything they say is ultimately an attack on the most oppressed groups. And of course, the least oppressed group are white males, and the most oppressed groups, I guess, are transgender black or minority groups. And there's a whole hierarchy and what you can say, where you are in the hierarchy. I mean, all that bullshit is coming straight out of the universities. And I think this idea that there's things that you cannot say, particularly if you're a white male, that you just cannot say them, is now infecting our workplaces as well. And while I do think there are things that you shouldn't be able to say, I mean, blatant racism, blatant putting down people, I mean, obviously are bad for the corporate culture and should clearly be banned from the workplace. And I think companies are completely legitimate in banning certain types of speech from the workplace because they're not good for corporate culture. But just disagreeing on politics and and again, I'll read this memo. I'll read sections of the memo to you. And the memo is, while again, I don't agree with much of it, is written from a very, I think, in a very respectful tone. And yeah, I can see that some people would be offended by it, but not offended to the point where this is it. I can't work here anymore. And I'd be microaggressed. It's ridiculous. You don't need to run to a safe space after reading this memo. You don't need to go cuddle a teddy bear. It really isn't that bad or that horrific. And yeah, argue against these ideas, fine. But this isn't a corporate culture destroying memo. And so I think the reaction is way over the top and ridiculous, and an example of the university culture that is anti-speech, anti-ideas that are supposedly unacceptable to the oppressed groups, now filtering into these companies and into these corporations and affecting them. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with that, and I appreciate that perspective.
Sure.
It helps clarify.
Good. Well, it's good to hear from you. It's been a while. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, thanks, Yaron. Thank you.
All right, we got another caller here. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hi, Yaron. This is Peter Severian. Thanks for taking my call.
Hi, Peter. Sure. Speak up a little bit because you're a little weak on your phone line.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Just speak. Just project a little bit with your voice.
Sure. So yeah, I agree with your response to the last caller, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Something I'm noticing with, I think, a lot of sort of this intersectionality, this sort of prevalent feminism in our culture, is sort of this idea that women have to be absolutely equal to men in all aspects of life. And I'm not talking about in the legal sense. I mean, I think both you and I would definitely agree that there shouldn't be any legal barriers at all preventing women from taking whatever field or position in the private sector that they choose to take. But there seems to be this idea that, like, if we don't have the same number of men and women in, say, the STEM field, then there must be some sort of enormous social injustice. And it doesn't make sense to me, like, what if the answer to that isn't that they're being discriminated against or there are these invisible barriers holding from them? What if women just choose not to pursue those goals because they have other interests?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But the question is, and it's a question to ask, right? It's not a question that needs a political answer, but it is an interesting question. Are women, so you can ask this question, you can ask it a number of different ways. You can ask it one way is, are women when they're young discouraged from studying math and science and therefore don't develop an interest? Is there an effort by parents, by teachers, by schools to discourage women from going into science and going into math and so on? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think there is discouragement. I don't think it's explicit, but I think that it's cultural. I think in the past there's been clearly this attitude: women belong in the kitchen, and a woman who is interested in math or interested in science, we don't want to encourage that. We want to, and that's weird and that's strange, and we treat her a little differently because of that. So I definitely think there's a cultural history that we cannot ignore. I mean, there's a famous story of, Curie. I think it's the scientist, something Curie. And she was up for, she did not, her husband got the Nobel Prize, she didn't. Even though they'd worked on everything together, because the Nobel Committee wouldn't recognize the achievement of a woman, right, in science, because women didn't do science. And the husband, to his credit, and a heroic act, said, "I'm not accepting the award unless she gets it as well," right? So there is Marie Curie. There are lots of these examples. There are lots of these examples where women in arts, where women in I mean, we can't ignore the fact that women until fairly recently were treated as if you belong in the kitchen. We don't want you in the workplace. So it's going to take a while for those biases, that conditioning, both in the schools and in the workplace, to go away. Ultimately, of course, so that's point one, that we have to recognize there's a history here. There are real biases. There's conditioning. There's conditioning that works against women achieving these things. It's deep in certain cultures. Certainly in Muslim culture, they couldn't even think about doing that. The more religious they are, the worse it is. But even in some more Christian cultures, certainly in religious Jewish culture, women are not supposed to do these things. They're not supposed to attain these professions. And you have to fight against that. You have to fight for equal rights, but more than equal rights, for an attitude that says women are capable, or at least everybody should have the opportunity. We shouldn't suppress their opportunity set. We shouldn't confine the opportunity set that people face because of their gender, because of their race, or because of anything like that. And then let's see which professions they gravitate towards. And it could very well be that when we take all the bias out, when we take all of that out, the women still gravitate towards different professions than men. Because at the end of the day, I believe that women are different than men on average, and we'll talk about what on average means. And that there are differences, and they could potentially manifest themselves in different professions. But I don't think today we know yet, because I still think our culture is imbued with biases against women in certain fields. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I haven't looked at all the evolutionary psychology literature on this, but yeah, I think what you were saying before, I think there could be some biological disposition for women to gravitate towards certain fields and be sort of more of a, sort of a nurturing motherly role, as opposed to sort of the, the administrative sort of role.
I don't know
think,
that's
though,
true.
That, you know,
And my point is this: what do I know? And this relates. And I'm going to take you offline and just answer this, and then we've got another question coming. But just so let's think of it in this terms. What do I know? I know that men and women are different physiologically. I know that they're different sexually. And I suspect, but I don't know for a fact, that these things manifest themselves in psychological differences, in different inclinations and so on. I don't buy the evolutionary psychology argument that the guy makes in the memo and that other people make, because I find that the evolutionary psychology are stories that people tell to explain things that they already believe. So they believe something and they tell an evolutionary story to justify what they're trying to, what they already believe in. So I'm very skeptical about any evolutionary biological story that people out there are trying to tell. But I don't know of any particular profession. And, we can get into women in the military. I'm not big. I don't believe women should be in combat positions. And, we can get into why I think that. But I don't think women should be in combat. Because I do think that there are these differences between men and women. And I think that men treat women differently than they treat other men. And I think that is not just conditioning. I think that is biology and justified biology. And so I think women in combat, for example, as a profession is dangerous. But professions of the mind, I don't see any limitations of women going there. And then it's an issue of choice. And it's an issue of what they choose. But you have to get to the point where the choices are really there. You have to get to the point where the system is not biased against them. And I would bet that the system in many schools is still biased against women in terms of math and science education. I would bet that in a lot of employment agencies and in a lot of employment places, there's still biases against women for certain professions. I think all that exists. And I think that the question is, how do you overcome those biases? And I think you overcome those biases not by laws or rules. You have to hire 40 women. You overcome those biases by making them conscious, by arguing against them, by showing counterexamples, and then by going out and still hiring the best person for a job, but being aware that you might be biased and making sure that you're being objective about who is better for the job. Now, it's funny, though, and this goes to the point you were making about the left. The left wants to have its cake and eat it too. And so does the right in many respects, right? So the left wants to say there's no difference between men and women. Men and women are exactly the same. This whole femininity, masculinity doesn't exist, or there's shades of it. Men are feminine and female are masculinity, and it's meaningless. It's all meaningless. Men and women are the same. And they should be everywhere equally represented, and everything should be exactly the same. And then they say, the reason we need women in software is because women write software differently than men. Women bring a whole different attitude to writing software. Women bring a whole different attitude to a user interface. Women are more collaborative. Women are this, women are that, women are, and all these virtues that women have, right? Okay, decide. If women are the same as men, then none of that is valid. They're just the same as men. If women are different than men, then acknowledge that they're different than men, and yeah, maybe they're better than men for a particular field, and then they bring all these virtues. And if they bring all these virtues, then you, as a CEO of a company, are an idiot for not hiring them because, wow, this will make me a lot of money if all this is true about what they bring to the workplace. And indeed, the best strategy in Silicon Valley would be, if all this is true, and if it's true that women are underpaid in Silicon Valley and all of that, then the best play for a startup in Silicon Valley right now would be to start a all-female tech company. And you could pay them a little bit more than what Google and everybody else pays them, but less than what you would have to pay guys, because there's this pay gap supposedly. And yet they are much better than the men because they bring all these virtues, and you would beat everybody. You would beat Apple and Google and all these male chauvinist companies. That would be the solution, right? That would be the market solution for the problem. So you can't have it both ways. Either men and women are the same or they're different. You can't have, and of course the right does the same thing, right? It says that women, and men are different, but then it says, oh, but we're not biased against women when it comes to tech, but many of them are, and it is suspicious, and many of them do believe that women belong in the kitchen or in certain professions and not in other professions, and they extend this idea of the differences between men and women way beyond their legitimacy, and they, in a sense, so. I mean, the left is completely bamboozled here, right? The left advocates for female reason, female logic, and male logic, but they're the same. How can they be the same in different logics? And the left embraces contradiction. I mean, that's the dominating characteristic of the modern left, is that they embrace contradiction. They have no problem with the idea of that they're saying the exact opposite things. It doesn't bother them. Of course, they get that from philosophers who say contradictions are fine, but contradictions don't exist. I believe women and men are different, and that we're just starting to understand in psychology what those differences are. I hope. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if we're really starting to understand that. I don't know that evolutionary psychology is giving out a lot of insight into that. I'm curious if there are any psychologists on the line who want to call in and express an opinion about that. But so they are different. But there's no female logic and male logic. I don't think there's female programming, male programming. I don't think there's female web interfaces and male user interfaces. I don't think they exist. And if I think they're better people and good employees and bad employees. They're good thinkers, bad thinkers. I think they're good programmers, mediocre and bad programmers. They're good user interface people. They're bad user interface people. And your job as a CEO is to hire the best damn people you can find, which is hard enough, without having to think about the balance of male and female and how many males and how many females you're hiring at every given point in time. And now you have to also make sure that none of them have ideas that you find offensive. Right. All right. We've got one more caller. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hey, Yaron. My name's Ed. How are you today?
I'm good. How about you?
Good. I just had a few quick things. First, I take no position on the evolutionary psychology thing because I don't know enough about it. But
Yep.
Jordan Peterson did interview the guy today.
Yep.
And it's on YouTube. And in the description of that YouTube video, Peterson went through and put references in for every claim he made, many to
all the claims are
not,
documented in the evolutionary psychology literature. Nothing this guy said in the memo is not based on research, whether it's good research or bad research. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that gets published in journals that we would object to. So whether it's good research or bad research, I don't know.
Absolutely.
But every one of his claims exists in the literature and in the research, and is claimed by evolutionary psychologists in the academic literature. There's no question about that.
No, I'm in tech, and my wife and I both have PhDs in physics,
Yep.
and I have a little bit of experience in this. When I was in high school, standard middle class public high school in the United States, really the best students on average in math and science were the girls.
Yep.
Now, I was obviously very good, but there were more girls than boys that were getting A's in math and science. When I moved to college, in the physics department, there were a lot fewer girls in the department, and they weren't necessarily the top performers. And when I moved to graduate school, there were only a couple of girls in the department, and very, very few. And so it's weird because the smart girls in high school who were my friends, a number of them went into literature, into languages.
Wow.
But the science-oriented ones, I know two of them went into biology. One of them went into like chemical engineering, and they didn't really go into the harder sciences. I mean, not that chemical engineering isn't hard; it's extremely hard.
Yes.
But you know what I mean.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
when you get when you get at the PhD level, there are just fewer women. And
so why do you think that is?
Now this was 30 years ago now, so I'm not 100% sure what it's like today. But I did do, until last year when I created my own company, I did do hiring for a tech company. And it was very rare to get a qualified female computer programmer resume that crossed your desk. We certainly would have loved to have hired high quality women, and we didn't participate in any. I mean, I'm sure there was an affirmative action program at the company, but nobody cared about it. We only wanted to hire the best people, but it was very, very rare that we got a female on a resume that crossed our desk. And I'm not 100% sure that it was because they were discouraged when they were kids, because when they were kids, they were doing really good. But in college and grad school, that might be more discouraging. I know my wife tells a story when she was in grad school, one of her friends, also female, got pregnant while in grad school. Yeah. And now again, this was back in the 90s.
Well, you say back in the 90s, this is with the dark ages, but it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. She was thrown out of the department for getting pregnant because the professors said you couldn't get a PhD and have a baby.
Wow.
So, I mean, she and my wife herself was subject of discrimination when she was in school.
So you agreeing with me that
firsthand from her,
that the ability is there, and that something happens along the road, and some of it might be that family is more important to some women. Some of it might be discrimination, but something clearly happens from those girls who are very interested and allowed to do the math and science to the PhD level, or even to just the computer science application, the computer programming, being an applicant, right? Something is going on in that transition.
If you don't get an even number, if you don't get a balanced number of applicants,
you can't hire a balance. No, obviously.
Have a balance without, hiring.
But that's the insanity of what Google and all these tech companies are trying to do. So they're trying to establish a balance when clearly they don't get enough applications for women. So they're trying to force this and cram this. And it's not even that, the fact that there are only 20%, let's say, women in tech positions in Google is not in and of itself proof of any bias if they're only getting 20% qualified applications, or the best applications 80% men. I mean, there's no proof of bias just by the numbers. The numbers don't reflect anything. Even if we believe in bias that exists, it's not reflected in these numbers. The numbers don't provide proof of that or evidence of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In Damore's interview with Peterson, he talks about a kind of a communist re-education camp seminar.
Yes, he mentions this in his. He mentions this in his memo. He talks about these conditioning places where they're supposed to get rid of these biases, or programs that are only for women, or programs that are only for minorities, and nobody else is allowed to attend. And it's the whole thing is, but this has been going on for decades at these companies and at universities and everywhere, and we're seeing the consequences. It is just horrific. It's collectivist.
On a related topic, if you give me just 30 more seconds, there is a company called Airbnb who is a middleman between people who want to rent rooms.
I'm going to cover this. Is this about the rally in Virginia?
Yeah, and there's some sort of a right-wing rally in Virginia. I think they took down a Robert E. Lee statue, and people aren't particularly happy about it, as they should be. Robert E. Lee was a relatively admirable fellow. But Airbnb is canceling the accounts of anyone they suspect attending this rally. Now, the interesting thing about Airbnb, and the reason I bring it up, is because they were sued by Holder's Justice Department back in 13, 14, 15, and they then came under a consent decree in 16, where they had to implement this whole list of SJW type of non-discrimination policies. And they basically took and appointed a diversity officer, basically forced by the government to do so. And then this sort of behavior on their part in Virginia about canceling the accounts of right-wingers is directly related, not to, the free market. They're a private company, they can do whatever they want, but directly related to Eric Holder's suing them for purported discrimination in the past. And so when we see some of these SJW attitudes in companies, it's not always the case that we can say, well, they're a private company, they can do what they want. Google's under tremendous pressure from competitors and the government to for potential antitrust violations. And perhaps Google is responding to that political pressure by enabling these.
Yeah, no, you're making a great point. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for the call. It looks like you've stimulated a bunch of other people to call. Let me piggyback off of what Ed said, because I think that's really important. There's no question in my mind that a lot of these companies are doing this because they're afraid of the political consequences if they don't do it. I mean, Google has come out of a huge amount of pressure to fire this guy. And my guess is, think about who the shareholders of all these companies are. They tend to be large pension plans. They tend to be public pension plans, like Culpers and Colsters here in California. They own huge percentages of these companies. And they come out of huge political scrutiny for these pension plans to do the politically correct kind of thing. But it's more than that. The Justice Department is looking at these companies. Actually, Google is under investigation right now by the Justice Department for supposedly underpaying women for the same job that men do. Now, I don't believe these studies about the pay gap, and we can get into this pay gap. A lot of this is nonsense. But think about what it means. The Justice Department is coming after them. So they have to be particularly worried about the Justice Department coming after them for an unsafe work environment on the part of women or whatever. Now, this was Holder, but that sued Airbnb. But think about even this Justice Department. You don't know what they're going to do, even though it's a different administration, because Google is still under suit. That is, they haven't withdrawn the lawsuit against Google. These things have certain momentums again. So a lot of this political correctness, a lot of this is not just adopting these ideas from universities, which is also going on, but it's also fear of government force, fear of the government stepping in and forcing you to do something about this if you don't act yourself. And so let me just fill you in on the Airbnb story. There's a rally in Virginia, a lot of kind of alt-right, some white supremacist groups and other groups are going to be at this rally. I don't think the rally is exclusively those groups, but it's a rally in Williamsburg, I think, in Virginia. And a lot of people are coming in and they're using Airbnb to rent places to stay. Airbnb is basically saying that if you rent your place out to anybody who participates in this rally, they're going to take you off of Airbnb, so that you're not going to be able to use their platform in order to make those rentals. Now, that's just astounding. Again, right? They wouldn't do this if it was some racist leftist cause, but they do it for racist right-wing causes. Now, they have a right to do it, and maybe it would be appropriate if they actually had a clear standard that apply to all kind of racist groups equally. But, you know, Airbnb is, again, discriminating certain positions. Now, I think what Ed just said about the fact that they have to be worried because of the lawsuit that they experienced, they got fined, they got, in a sense, they did a kind of consent decree. They have to be worried. So this could be the over-response to what the government forced them into. Once you hire a diversity VP, once you bring people like that with that mentality into your company, all kind of really, really bad things are going to happen. And this is what all these companies have done over the years. They've been forced, in a sense, by the government and by pressure groups and by shareholders and by all kind of people to create these kind of positions. And again, once these positions are created, they're going to morph into all kinds of nasty things. All right, we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back after this.
At AynRand.org, find out what the Ayn Rand Institute is doing to bring honesty and reason to the way we all deal with each other, the way countries should act toward each other. And if you're curious, at AynRand.org, you can learn about objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, which says your life belongs to you, and it's your right to live it for your own sake. Philosophy? Who needs it? you do. Find out more about the Ayn Rand Institute at aynrand.org. That's AYNRAND.org.
All right, we are talking about the Google memo, the whole mess that it created, the firing of the guy who wrote the Google memo, and the memo itself, and the whole attitude towards diversity and gender and that exists in Silicon Valley, but not just in Silicon Valley. All companies, Google is just a very high-profile company and comes under great scrutiny, and but it is also a symbol of kind of the left-leaning progressive agenda that's out there in so much of the world, and this idea of a diversity VP exists all over corporate America today. I mean, they have to, because they could be sued. The government can come after them, particularly in the Obama administration. This was prevalent to come after them for not hiring enough blacks or Hispanics or women or whatever. This has become the role of government is supposedly to protect us from these companies that might discriminate against some people, and some of them do discriminate. But again, not the job of government, not the role of government to intervene in our lives and dictate who people should hire, and these diversity goals of setting a number and hiring people to meet the number rather than hiring the best people out there, but making sure in your hiring there is no bias, training people who do the hiring not to be biased, and making sure that in your business you create an environment that is welcoming for anybody who is talented. It's great. But you see, this is the problem. The left has a collectivist agenda, and then what happens is that people come back with a kind of an alternative collectivist agenda, saying things like, women have skills XYZ. It's just stupid. It's just stupid. It's, again, talking about averages and not about a woman. All that matters when you're hiring people is this individual qualified? Does this individual have the skills? What women, the group of women, do, or what on average women are inclined towards, is irrelevant to your actual hire. Right? You hire the best person. So the individual that you're out there hiring is what you should care about. Evolutionary psychology has no relevance to the hiring of women in high tech. Anyway, and I know, by the way, Jordan Peterson is big on this evolutionary psychology, particularly when it comes to gender roles, the differences between genders. And indeed, this memo that was written, it could have been written by Jordan Peterson. I mean, many of these claims about what kind of work environments would be good for women and under what conditions women would excel versus men very much comes out of the teachings of Jordan Peterson. I wouldn't be surprised if the guy who wrote this memo had watched a lot of Jordan Peterson videos and read his books and was inspired by Jordan Peterson to write this. It's part of the stuff that I don't completely agree with Jordan Peterson on. But, all right, we've got another call. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this? Hello? 614 area code.
Hello?
Yes, now I can hear you. Speak up.
Sorry, I'm calling from overseas, so I couldn't really tell if you were talking to me.
Okay.
I just wanted to come in and talk about my experience because I work for a big tech company, and I'm obviously female, and there are really two elements here because I have a background in economics and psychology, and so this really struck a chord with me. I feel that there's like a fundamental misunderstanding of statistics that this guy doesn't really do a very good job of explaining.
Yep.
But it's basically a lack of understanding that you can't really generalize from a population to an individual. This is what he tries to explain, but I think the left is often so quick to identify, to try and ascribe features from a population to an individual, that they think that that's what people are doing, even though this guy's underlying premises was not to do something like that. So that's the first element that I think people...
Yeah, let me just address that. I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting because he tries to go out of his way to make that point. I mean, he even has a graph in the memo that says, look, there's a difference between average and between an individual. And he actually has a line here. He says at the end of one point, he says, treat people as individuals, not as just another member of the group, parentheses, tribalism.
Yeah.
And he tries to make this point, but I think you're right. I think in the world we live in today, you have to make a much stronger effort to differentiate between averages and when an individual might fall on a distribution.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what, I mean, if you don't have that underlying understanding, then you can't begin to even engage in this argument.
I agree completely.
The second point is that I studied economics, so I've always had a pretty quantitative background. But I went to uni sort of in the 2010s or like late 2005 to 2008. So I have never felt like I was sort of a woman in the workplace or a woman in like a male-dominated field until I got to a tech company.
Interesting.
Basically, not because I was made to feel like that by my coworkers or by the work I was doing, but because of all this focus on diversity and the fact that, you know, in a tech company you have to like join a million groups to do with whatever your identity is, and I think it really undermines the confidence that women have in their ability to compete in the workplace when they're constantly being told, no, you must have been discriminated against. You know, this is what happened. You must be discriminated against. Even if you don't know it, it must be a thing that's happening to you. And I think we've kind of reached a point in a lot of developed societies. I don't know what it's like in broader America, but certainly in most developed societies, we've reached a point where there's nothing actively, really it's a matter of socialization, and you just have to kind of wait for the generation to roll through and for, you know, it to be more mainstream that women are, and their friends, because a lot of the choice of like what do you do at school, what do you do at uni is down to peer interest. So, you know, you want to go to class with your friends, and until, you know, it's basically just a matter of time and waiting for the generation to you know, roll through, and so more women are.
I think that's right. Although I think that's right. Although if you look at some of the sexual harassment cases coming out of Silicon Valley, and out of Fox News and out of other places, I do think that there still is, and maybe it's an age issue and maybe it's a generational issue. There still is an element of sexual harassment out there, and it's nowhere near as prevalent, I think, as, for example, I don't know, did you ever see the show Mad Men?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way women are treated in that show is just so horrific and so counter to the way I think people behave today that it's shocking, right? So we've come a huge way from the 1960s and the way Mad Men women were treated. Are we all the way to where it should be? I don't know. You know better than I do because you're in the workplace and you experience this on a day-to-day basis. And I tend to believe you when you say the younger generation doesn't have these hang-ups. It doesn't exist as much. And we're well on the way to getting rid of the remnants of these biases that have existed in society for thousands of years. And that's great. And that's civilization. And that's what it's about. And that's, you know, where we're heading. And if anything, I think you're also right that the left, by keep saying, no, you're being discriminated against. No, there is really bias. No, you're wrong. Things are much worse than you think they are, is making it worse, is actually resurrecting these biases and resurrecting this. I mean, so they're making it 100 times worse, much worse than what it needs to be. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of that is on point. And it's good to hear that you don't feel any kind of bias in the workplace other than from that. So you're not getting it from your colleagues. You're not getting it from management. Exactly. You're not getting it from your place. And that's good. That's good news. That's progress. That's where we're heading.
But I also think that it's dangerous because it might trigger a pushback from, you know, alt-right groups, which, you know, Trump is kind of exhibit A in this respect. So that's why I think it's is a little bit dangerous to continue down this line.
Well, no, I think what the left is doing is creating the alt-right, and what the left has done is created the alt-right. I think Trump's election was a response to the nuttiness of the left, and I think the nuttier they get, the worse the right will become, because what they share, and there's a little bit of that in this memo, and there's a little bit of that even in Jordan Peterson, what they share is collectivism, or elements of collectivism, and then every time the left goes wacky in its collectivism, the right doubles up on its collectivism. And I've said that I think that the real differentiation politically, the real differentiation philosophically is not left or right. It's individualism versus collectivism. And
individualism.
Yeah,
exactly.
and it's about individualism. It's about this sentence that he buries here, which he should have made a much bigger deal about. He says, treat people as individuals, not as just another member of the group. If that would have been his focus from the beginning, then I think that the memo would have been much better. And if he downplayed the evolutionary psychology and not had the pretense, because in the memo he actually proposes to Google how to create a work environment friendly to women, which I think is incredibly pretentious for some young programmer to write. If he, instead of that, attacked what the treating everybody as groups, he falls into the same trap of treating people like group. And then he realizes that, so he writes something about individualism, but that's not the essence of what he's writing.
Yeah, that might be true. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of who he's communicating to as well.
Yes,
he
I agree.
Clearly needs to think about his audience a little bit more.
Agree. Good. Well, really appreciate you calling.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. All right, one more caller. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this? Hey, 440 area code. Hello?
Hi, this is Rebecca. I'm a software engineer in North Carolina.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I actually had similar experiences to the previous caller, but I actually went to university, got a computer science degree, did not have any, there's always the naysayers throughout, like, oh, you're not going to do this, you're not going to do this. But I've always been the type of person that said, I don't believe you, and I'll prove you wrong.
Good.
So I think that there has been, I know that with a lot of my friends that were that are women, they tended to need more, or they were like, oh, I can't do computer programming, and that's just a generalization. But I was always, there's definitely been situations throughout my career where I'm like, oh yeah, I've been that was inappropriate to ask me that, or not from a sexual harassment perspective, but just like, hey, you wouldn't have asked me that if I was a guy.
Yep.
And there was a specific instance of when I got interviewed at a previous employer. Once they found out that my husband at the time was also a software engineer, they were like, oh, they didn't help you on your homework, did they? And I was like,
oh, wow.
No.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I think there's a bias out there and people still behave in inappropriate ways. And I think many more women are saying, I don't care, to hell with you, I'm going to do this anyway. And I think we're going to see more and more women enter into these fields, and the bias goes away at the end because people will get educated, and if not, they will be the ones who fall out. So I think it's a self-correcting thing, but it takes time. Biases don't go away culturally all at once. It's ridiculous to expect it just to disappear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we were, I think because it's such a male-dominated field, and I, for one, completely disregard like the gender pay gap. It's like, no, I get paid my fair share. I think that women need to fight for what they think they're worth. So I think that's where it comes, negotiation.
Well, there's the whole thing about, there's a whole thing in the cognitive, in evolutionary psychology, there's the whole thing about women, because they're collaborative and because they've got all these attributes, don't fight for their own wages enough, and they're not assertive enough, and they're not all of this, and this explains the wage gap and so on. And which again, I just don't, I think is a misunderstanding of the data. I don't think is true. I think a lot of that is socially Again, it's how we're brought up, and there are plenty of women like you who don't seem to be shy at all about asking for raises and going in and asserting themselves. And so I don't think there's anything ingrained. I know a lot of guys who are afraid to ask their boss for a raise. I don't think that's. I think it's about individuals. It's not about women this, men this, women this, men this. I think that's very dangerous to do. Very dangerous to do.
Yeah, the individual, it really does come down to the individual. And as soon as more men realize that in the fields, like the bias that is not in the younger generation as much, but once they realize that women are just individuals too, then it will
well, and they realize that some of these women are better than them, and they better shape up and they better work hard, because they can't compete. And when they start realizing that, and when they encounter more and more women like that, they will stop feeling the bias, because they will have, it'll be right in their face.
But the diversity training and all that stuff, it's got to go. It makes me feel more self-conscious at the workplace than it does like, oh, am I being hired because I'm a woman, or not by my merits. That's the biggest. I'm like, if I find out that a company did that, then I leave them, because I couldn't. Oh no, I think it completely destroys my self-esteem.
I agree with you. It's completely destructive to women, and when they do it to blacks, or they do it to anybody, it destroys. You Absolutely. Don't know if you got the job for legitimate reasons. Your coworkers don't know if you got the job for legitimate reasons. It creates a very, very sick dynamic, a very, very unhealthy dynamic within a company and within the own individual's mind. And all of these affirmative action, diversity stuff, it all needs to go. And all these companies need to treat people as individuals, and they need to hire based on the individual's ability. And whatever the outcome is, 20% women, 80% men, 80% women, 20% men, whatever the outcome is, it is. That's what it is. But you hire based on skill. You don't hire based on gender or any other irrelevant criteria like that. All right, thanks. Really appreciate the call.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. And okay, we got a couple of other callers. I just want to say something more about the memo. I think the memo wants to be individualistic. I mean, he's torn. He holds, I think, collectivistic premises about women. And he holds certain ideas about women that are, I think, collectivist. But he knows he's not supposed to be a collectivist, and he believes in individualism. So he brings in the individualism to kind of cover himself. But unfortunately, it's not balanced enough, and there's not enough emphasis on the individualism. He doesn't develop it from an individualistic perspective. If he really developed it from an individualistic perspective, I think it would have been a better memo. How it would have received it at Google is hard to say, but it would have just been a better memo. This could have really been a manifesto against diversity hiring. It could have been a manifesto about the importance of dealing with individuals as individuals and hiring the best people for the job. Instead, my sense is he wanted to show off his knowledge of evolutionary psychology, of the differences between men and women, and how you would create. He wanted to take the stuff he learned from Jordan Peterson and put it in the memo. And he's not a psychologist. He's not an expert. Why even get into this? All of this was unnecessary. He didn't need to get into this in order to make the point of Google shouldn't be hiring women because they're women. Google shouldn't have a goal of hiring X number of women. What Google should have is an unbiased approach to hiring. Hire the best individuals. And if that individual's a woman, great. If that individual's a man, great. It doesn't matter. That should have been the approach. Instead of what I consider, in this case, the evolutionary psychology mumbo jumbo. And it's mumbo jumbo not because it might not have elements of truth to it, but because even if it does, he's not qualified to talk about it, and he doesn't know it's true. And yeah, he's citing academic research, but I bet you there's academic research that contradicts this that nobody cites. I mean, academic research, I know from being an academic, you can find pretty much anything that you want. And just because it's in a good journal doesn't mean it's true. And you have to be careful. You have to watch what you do. You have to know what you know. And you have to have knowledge. And is it firsthand knowledge? Does he really know this stuff? Or is he doing this just to impress us with how much he knows about evolutionary psychology? I find most people who talk about evolutionary psychology don't know what they're talking about. And again, Jordan Peterson is an exception. He knows what he's talking about. He believes in it. I don't necessarily agree with him, but at least he's qualified to talk about this stuff. All right. I think the memo could have been a lot better if he'd focused on the individualistic aspect of all these things. All right, I'm gonna take another quick break, and then we've got 2 more phone calls.
The Ayn Rand Archives has more than 1,500 photographs of Ayn Rand, her life, and her work. Become an ARI monthly sustainer today, and you are eligible to receive the Ayn Rand photo series every month. These high-quality reproductions, each with historical anecdotes provided by the archives, will be shipped to you in a protective sleeve and are suitable for framing or for collecting in a photo album. Becoming an ARI monthly sustainer is the most convenient way to contribute. Your automated monthly gift of just $25, that's less than $1 per day, helps to sustain our vital programs and qualifies you to receive the Ayn Rand photo series. When your first monthly contribution is made, you'll receive the first set of 2 photos. Then for as long as you contribute at least $25 a month, you'll receive an additional set of 2 photos each month. For residents outside of the United States, a monthly donation of $50 is required to receive the photo series. Signing up is quick and easy. Just go to aynrand.org/donate and look for the link at the bottom of the page to become an ARI sustainer.
All right, before we take the calls, let me just say something about pay gap, because I think it's just important to cover this, and I want to make sure I cover that and give time for this talk, for the calls. We don't have a lot of time left on the show. Look, I don't buy that the pay gap is real in the sense that when you look at men and women who do the same job, the same function, the pay gap for the most part goes away. And if you look at it holistically from the perspective of the employer, in terms of taking into account the risk of leaving, the risk of the fact is that women tend to take off more time for childcare than men do. If you take into all those kind of issues related to age, related to the probability of having children and taking time off and all of that, and you compare the pay gap, it goes away when you compare the same profession, the same, the exact same job, if you will. The pay gap almost goes away. And again, if the pay gap really exists for the same exact job, then why aren't they all female law firms that take advantage of that, or all female technology firms that take advantage of it? I mean, there's a huge capitalist potential there to make money, and by eliminating the pay gap, if it really is a real thing. And again, even if it exists, the government has no role. The government has no role to play in investigating it and penalizing people for it and forcing companies to eliminate the pay gap, and so on. So government has no place in it. Evolutionary psychology, we're going to have to do a show on evolutionary psychology. It's to get into it is too complex to do on this show, but I'll try to find somebody who's an expert on this and bring them on a show, not to debate, but to educate us and to hopefully provide some data, some objective data on what the state of the field of evolutionary psychology really is. And I see in the comments, I mean, there's a lot of discussion of women are this and men are this, and I would just caution you to be careful, because what does that even mean? I mean, I know women at a whole, there's a whole spectrum of behavior, of attributes, of traits, and I know men with the whole spectrum. And the question is not what women are, what men are, what this individual is. I think we have to be very careful when we treat people as groups, and when we try to evaluate these things as groups. And again, for practical purposes, for employment purposes, for other purposes, these differences, the differences between individuals are far more significant than the differences between groups. So the group average is meaningless for practical purposes. All right, we're going to take another call. Hi, you're on the Yaron Brook Show. Who's this?
Hey, Yaron.
Hey. Go ahead.
I called on your show last week. I'm a 17-year-old high school student.
Yes, yes.
And I don't have, obviously, much experience with the environment in the workplace yet, right?
Sure.
But why do you think so many smart, well-educated people are believing this nonsense, this diversity nonsense?
Well, because I think they've learned to accept guilt. I think altruism, the idea of moral altruism, teaches people that they have to be victims, and they have to, if they're doing well in life, they should feel guilty about it. And there's a victim out there that needs to be taken care of. That their role in life is to take care of them. I think at the end of the day, it's a combination of altruism with a lack of just thinking, of people not really using reason, not really using their rational minds, and not thinking these issues through. But there is this whole attitude. There's this whole attitude in our culture that is anti-success, anti-letting yourself feel success, and always bringing up, there's a victim. Let's find this victim. Let's find that victim. And elevating the victim. And this is what altruism does. It elevates the victim. The meek shall inherit the earth. The meek are the powerful. They're the important ones. Everything is the standard is the meek. And we need victims to keep this feeding. We need it. So we always need to present things in terms of who's being victimized today. And I think this the postmodernists, the left as it constituted today, is very much motivated by this idea of continuously searching for victims and continuously encouraging people to feel guilt about somebody else's victimhood. So this altruistic idea of you must sacrifice for them. There must be something wrong with you if you're successful. And people about now why do ultimately they buy into this partially because there's very little cogently spoken against it, that there's just too much people accepting this is just a given and not challenging it on campuses, in the workplace, and other places, and it becomes entrenched. And to speak up against it, you might get fired, or you might be harassed, or you might be demonstrated against, and it becomes part of the culture, and it's very difficult to dislodge.
Yeah, don't you think this also shows like the progress of our, just how much we have progress, and that like we don't really have many real problems, right? So we just have to make up problems, and fight for them, sort of.
In a sense, that's right. That we don't have any real problems, so we're not struggling over food. So now we're struggling to figure out what bathrooms transgender people should go to. So
right.
In a sense of material progress, I think that's true. I have a friend who would say, these are rich people's problems, right? These are rich cultures' problems. Poor cultures can't bother with these problems. They're too busy just trying to survive, right? So yes,
they try to get food, get through the day, sort of. Right?
I definitely think that's true, but I also think that we are making progress in dealing with real issues, and there are fewer and fewer victims, and therefore I think the left has to stretch constantly to find a new victim, to find a new group that is being oppressed and is being victimized. So I think a lot of progress was made after the civil rights movement around racism, and I think racism was dissipating, and I think it's the left, to a large extent, that has caused racism to become an issue again. I think with regard to sexism, I think sexism is in decline. It hasn't gone away completely, but it's in the decline. Mm-hmm. But the left wants it to keep going because they need these problems in order to justify their own existence. They need conflict. They need this. So things are getting better, even with regard to real issues, to these issues that the left brings up, to the issues of racism, to the issues of sexism, to the issue of how we treat women with regard to professions. I mean, there are many more computer programmers today that are women than you would have imagined 20 or 30 years ago, and the same with minorities and so on. So we made progress. We seem in the last few years to be slipping backwards, and I think we're slipping backwards because the left keeps reminding us about how racist we are. And then the left keeps emphasizing racism, keeps emphasizing collectivism, keeps talking about collectivism, and then the racists rise up in a sense of the modern racists are rising up to some extent as a backlash against the left. And I think that to a large extent the Trump phenomena is a backlash against the nuttiness of the left. But again, what that results is nuttiness on the right, and we have to be careful not to buy into the nuttiness of either side. And the essential here is to identify collectivism when you see collectivism and reject it and emphasize individualism. And that's what again, I think and I'm repeating myself here, but the Google Memo doesn't do. He doesn't spend enough time emphasizing the individualistic case for what he's trying to argue for. And he gets too caught up in his evolutionary psychology mumbo jumbo or whatever, or whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
It's just that's not what this should be about. That's not the essence. And to say that men and women are different, okay, but even that is not relevant. Let's say men and women are different, and let's say it affects their ability to be programmers. It still shouldn't affect your hiring. Your hiring should still be you hire the best person for a job, and if a woman is the best person for the job, you hire a woman. And the averages of what the population is inclined towards is irrelevant to what this particular individual is capable of, what this particular individual's skill set is. And that's all that's relevant in the hiring process. So he undercuts his own case, even though he has some good elements here. He undercuts the good elements with the bad stuff. And that's what the people on the right do all the time. And that's what conservatives do all the time. And again, you can tell that this is the negative influence, I think, of Jordan Peterson, that a lot of his fans think they just accept what he says and they think they understand it and they think they know it and they think they can apply it and they rush out and they think this is a legitimate application of the stuff that he teaches. And I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think half of this, 3/4 of this memo is complete garbage and nonsense. Now, I don't believe he should be fired for this. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, he's stating positions that are not completely wacko. They're not completely crazy. They're within the realm of something that can be discussed in a civilized way. He is not expressing racist or even radically sexist ideas. I mean, I disagree with his view on women in general, and but it's not. This is not crazy stuff that you would say, "Oh my God, you can't have an employee like this at Google." I mean, it's nuts that Google felt like it had to fire him. And again, there's all kind of pressure on Google from all kind of places. It's not necessarily that management is doing this of their own free will and free choice, because there are political pressures, not just societal pressures that they could resist.
Right.
But it's still sad that we live in a world where somebody puts out a memo that says what this guy's saying, and he says it in a, quote, reasonable way. He's not being, he's not being offensive, particularly in this. When I read it, I was surprised at the big deal people make of it. Again, I don't agree with it, but it's still within the realm of something civilized you can talk about. And he could have, he's got some really good sentences here. And if he'd taken the good stuff and he'd restructured the memo, it would be a great memo. It would be something we could use to, here's a manifesto against the idea of diversity hiring. And for hiring based on individualism, but he doesn't do that, so he misses out. Great. I'm really happy to hear that you're listening to the show and you're calling in and keep it up. So thank you.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with everything that you said.
All
and
right.
Also, one of your previous callers also said that women tend to do very good when they're in high school.
Yep.
And that has been my experience also.
Yep.
In math and science, there are a lot of girls at my school who are doing really good in math and science.
Good. And you know, when I went to engineering school, thanks for calling. Really appreciate it. When I went in engineering school, half my class were women, and over half the class, and this is another stereotype and another one of those, over half the class were Arab. And this was and many of them were women. I'd say 75% of the Arabs were women, and they were studying engineering with me in a class, and this was in the This is in the 1980s, right? So, and this was in Israel at the Israeli Institute of Technology. And this whole idea of women can't do it, or Arabs or Muslims can't be engineers, or no good, or whatever. It's just, these generalizations are unhelpful. They're just unhelpful. And they don't focus in on the real problems. They don't focus on the real issues. I mean, there is a real interesting question in psychology about differences between masculinity and femininity and men and women, and it's interesting. But to start mixing that up into the hiring at Google is nuts and crazy and inappropriate, and from both the leftist diversity nuts and the right wing who want to create a different space for women programmers because they program differently. I mean, if that were the case, then my guess is that there are lots of men who program differently and men who enjoy different kind of environments in which they're more productive, and women who and those groups would be mixed groups. And the whole thing of viewing people as members of the group as the primary is incredibly destructive. It's destructive business-wise. It's destructive psychologically to you. It's destructive in your relationships with other people. What's important is the character, the skills, the ability, and depending, of course, on the particular context of the individual in front of you. Now, I mean, one of these shows I'll do something on women in the military and in combat, because I think there's a slightly different set of rules there that apply in situations that are by definition emergency situations, which is what the nature of the military is. It's to engage in warfare which is an emergency, and the question is the question of the attitude of women towards men and men towards women. I think is relevant in those kind of situations, in those kind of emergency situations. And my conclusion for that is that women should not be in combat. But again, that's a whole other topic, irrelevant to the discussion about Google, which is not an emergency situation, which is not physical by its nature. It's not relevant to anything about this. All right. All right. So we've talked about Google. I didn't have a chance to really go through this, but it doesn't matter. I think you get the sense that, I mean, the memo is decently written. It's in a calm tone. I don't think it's really hysteric. There's no hysteria here. He tries to make the case, and in spite of the claims he makes about men and women, for example, he says, here's another good sentence. He says, many of these differences are small, the differences between men and women, the average differences are small, and there's significant overlap between men and women. So you can't say anything about an individual given these population level distributions. I think that's great. And if he'd really focused on that, rather than articulating the whole case about the differences, I don't know that it would have made a difference out there to the social justice warriors, but it certainly would have made a difference to many of us, and it might have made a difference to the level of defense he gets. But I think this whole case, and the case we talked about with regard to Twitter and to YouTube and to Airbnb and all of this stuff, and then if you look at what's happening at the universities, I mean, there's a real chilling effect, and there's a real challenge in our culture, in particular parts of the culture. In Silicon Valley, as much as I love it, and many of you who listen to the show know that I admire and love Silicon Valley. I love technology companies. I love entrepreneurs. I love their productive genius. I love Google and Apple and YouTube and Amazon. Amazon is one of my favorites these days, and all these companies are fantastic, right? And but there is a certain culture in these places that is way too leftist, and this attitude towards what is a acceptable working environment, but you can't have certain points of view or can't articulate certain points of view because that makes for a hostile work environment, is ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and it's going to distort our culture in ways that are hard for us to predict, and it's going to silence people, and it's going to, and this is how the alt-right came into existence, as a backlash against that. And maybe that's just the beginning. There are going to be other backlashes against it that are going to be more dangerous than what the alt-right is doing. And it's going to get worse and worse. And we're going to get more and more bifurcated around these issues. The collectivists of the right and the collectivists of the left are going to fight each other even more and more and more. And the space for being a true individualist is going to disappear. And I really do blame, at least on this level, this on the left, on the kind of postmodern, violent, anti-free speech left that is just out of control and is now gone from the universities. And again, not all universities, some universities, not all professors, some professors, but has gone out to some of these companies. I mean, I saw this, I was going to bring this up, but I saw this story about something about the alt-right coming out of this Google thing. I can't find the story right now. In the story, they call Ben Shapiro alt-right. And they call Weinstein, the leftist professor at Evergreen College, who objected to the craziness of the real nutcases on Evergreen College. But he's a lefty himself. He was called alt-right in this article. Right? I mean, when you start labeling people that way without any kind of definition, without any kind of sense of what is really going on in reality, you're just going to create a more hostile world, a more antagonistic world, a more collectivistic world, a world in which people are going to build walls around their points of view, where there's going to be no real discussion and real dialogue, and where we're going to resort more and more to violence. And the fact that it's entering the workplace, the fact that you can't have opposing views at Google, it's scary. It really is scary. Yeah. I mean, Ben Shapiro, alt-right, Ben Shapiro has been attacked viciously by the alt-right. I mean, they've the worst kind of anti-Semitic comments. I mean, Milo has gone after Ben Shapiro in some of the ugliest language I've ever heard. One of the reasons I dislike Milo so much is the way he treated Ben Shapiro, and anti-Semitic stuff. Now, again, Milo does it supposedly as a joke, but what it represents is not funny at all. It's not funny at all. Okay. We spent a whole 2 hours on this. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Lots of callers. I enjoyed that. So thank you to all the callers who called in. Thank you to all of you who were listening. And next week, I can't remember right now what day the show is, but I will let you know. It's either Monday or Tuesday next week. And thanks for listening. Don't forget, on Sunday, there's the show The Blaze. Don't forget also that all this is on Blog Talk Radio, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Periscope. Please, particularly YouTube and Blog Talk Radio, please share those. Let your friends, if you enjoyed the show, let your friends know. Hopefully they'll share it too. Let's get the word out. Hopefully this analysis is of value to the world out there. Help me get a wider distribution for these ideas. Thank you all for listening. Talk to you all next week.
90 seconds